Baldwood presents Murder in the Tuscan Hills, written by T.A. Williams and read by Simon Mattox. Chapter 1. Tuesday, late afternoon. I knew it was time to stop when the figures on the screen in front of me started to blur. I glanced at my watch and saw that I'd been doing my online forensic cybersecurity course for 3 straight hours now. In case I had any doubts about it, a movement at my feet told me that Oscar was also getting fed up. He pulled himself up, stretched, yawned, and then looked up at me as much as to say, "Enough's enough, Dan. I need a walk." He was right. I knew that we both needed some fresh air, so I closed the laptop, stood up, and walked over to the window. It was wide open, but there wasn't a breath of wind outside, and the sticky mid-September heat that had settled over Tuscany for the past few days showed no signs of relenting. It had been a long, hot summer, and it looked as though that trend was going to continue into the autumn. I looked down at my 4-legged friend and saw the end of his tail wag hopefully. "Feel like walking down to the town?" He did. Outside, in the shade of the cypress trees that lined the track leading to Monte Volpone, it was a degree or two fresher, but I could still feel my T-shirt sticking to my back all the same. The gravel beneath my feet was as dry as a bone, and the vineyards on either side looked parched. I spotted the familiar figure of one of my neighbours in among the rows of vines and went across to say hello. "Ciao, Cesare. How's the harvest looking?" It came as no surprise to see him shake his head gloomily as he bent down to study a bunch of deep blue-black grapes. "Quality good, but quantity a disaster. As you know, it's hardly rained at all for 2 months, and the grapes are small. I'm sure the wine will be good, but there just won't be as much of it as there was last year." He removed his flat cap and used the palm of his hand to wipe the sweat from his bald head. "I've never known it so hot for September." I knew how he felt. Although it was a tiny bit cooler up here where we lived in the hills to the south of Florence than it was in the city itself, even here the nighttime temperature had remained stubbornly high. 30 years working as a detective at Scotland Yard in London had taught me a lot, but not how to enjoy stifling heat. Since retiring from the force and moving to Tuscany, I could honestly say that I had very few regrets, but just occasionally the idea of a cool summer's day in England did have considerable appeal. For the first time, I had found myself seriously considering installing air conditioning, something I had steadfastly rejected since moving in 2 years earlier. I glanced down at my Labrador, who was hugging the shade, and reflected that at least I didn't have a fur coat. Tuscany isn't just hot for humans. After a chat with Cesare, who was well over 70 but still looked as fit as a flea, I carried on down the track to the town. In spite of the heat, there was a lot of activity in the vineyards where preparations were being made for the imminent start of the vendemmia, the all-important grape harvest. As we walked, Oscar still managed to muster the energy to forage for pine cones and sticks for me to throw for him to retrieve. Mind you, he's only 3, so 54 years younger than me. The idea of running about in this heat had no attraction for me whatsoever. I pulled out my phone and called my girlfriend, Anna. She answered immediately, but in little more than a whisper. "Ciao, Dan. I'm in the library. All well?" She's a lecturer in medieval and Renaissance history at Florence University, and she likes nothing more than to spend hours poring over ancient manuscripts. Not really my cup of tea, but after 3 hours glued to a computer screen, I was a fine one to talk. Still, I thought to myself, the advantage of the library was that it had aircon. "All good, thanks, just hot. Are you still planning on coming out here after work?" Although we'd been living together in my house out here in the hills over the summer, she had returned to her apartment in the centre of Florence for a couple of busy weeks while she prepared for the new intake of students. Her house had the saving grace of being 500 years old. With walls twice the thickness of modern house walls, it managed to keep out the extreme heat quite successfully, but it was still more uncomfortable than out here. "Yes, I've almost finished, so hopefully I'll be out in half an hour or so." She then went on to show that she knows me so very well, after almost a year together. "Do you want me to pick you up from the bar in Monte Volpone?" "That would be excellent. Oscar and I are just walking down there now. See you soon." 20 minutes later, I was sitting under a faded parasol, sipping a very welcome cold beer, while Oscar made a right mess of the flagstones at my feet as he slurped up the bowlful of water brought by Monica, the owner. Here, Shaded from the sun by the bulk of the old church, it was a bit cooler, and the cold beer definitely helped. A lot. I'd been there for only a couple of minutes when my phone started ringing. It was Lena, my receptionist, PA, and friend, the cornerstone of Dan Armstrong Private Investigations. "Ciao, Dan. I hope I haven't interrupted your work." From the way she said it, I had a feeling she knew full well that I was at the bar. It was a quiet week, and although Tuesday was normally a working day for me, I had decided to stay at home to do the latest module of the highly complex cybersecurity course, and she knew how hard I was finding it. For somebody who had spent 30 years of his life as a Scotland Yard detective, writing everything down in a little notebook, I still found computers a challenge. But in my line of business as a private investigator, I didn't have any choice. "Ciao, Lena. My eyes are just about starting to focus again after 3 hours staring at the screen. What's new?" "I've just had a call from one of your neighbours. He says he needs your help." "Really? Who?" "A man called Fausto Giardino. He says he knows you. Do you know him?" "Fausto? Yes, indeed. His farm is only a kilometre or so from my place, and he makes excellent Chianti. What's the problem?" "He wouldn't tell me over the phone." Lena sounded puzzled and a little bit miffed. "He only wants to speak to you, and he asks you to call him. Do you want his number?" I copied the phone number in my notebook. Old habits die hard, and thanked Lena for calling, telling her I'd be back in the office in the morning. Before phoning Fausto, I sat and thought for a minute or two. Although Oscar and I often walked past his place, and I usually stopped to exchange pleasantries with him, I didn't know him as well as I'd known his father, Amadeo, who had died back before Christmas. Fausto was an accountant by profession, but since his father's death, he'd found himself balancing 2 jobs, accounts and farming. Especially now, at vendemmia time, I felt sure he must be working himself to death, and I wondered whether this was what was worrying him, and if so, how I could help. I picked up the phone again, determined to give him all the assistance I could. In fairness, I did have a vested interest, considering that I had always bought my regular supply of Chianti from his vineyard, and I wanted that to continue. He answered the phone almost immediately. "Pronto." "Good afternoon, Fausto. It's Dan Armstrong. How can I help?"
"Ah, Signor Armstrong, thank you for calling so quickly."
There was a short pause.
"I have a problem."
From his tone of voice, it sounded as if it was serious. "Call me Dan, please. What sort of problem? The sort that can be discussed over the phone, or would you like to meet up? I could come to see you, if you like." He answered instantly.
"No, absolutely not. Could I come to see you? I know where your house is."
Although I've been trying to keep my business commitments as far away from home as possible for Anna's sake, I was quick to agree. After all, this was a neighbour. His reluctance for me to visit him made me wonder whether maybe his might be a marital problem. I'd never met his wife, although I'd seen her in the distance once. Maybe things weren't going swimmingly between them. I checked my watch and saw that it was just after 6, so we arranged that he would come around at 7. But I couldn't help fishing for a bit more information first. "Can you give me some idea what this is about?" His voice when he replied was little more than a whisper.
"It's Maria, my wife."
I gave him a few seconds to say more, but when nothing was forthcoming, I gave him a little prod. "Is something wrong with her? Have you been arguing?"
"No, nothing like that. It's just that she's..."
Another long pause.
"She's awfully happy."
Of all the adjectives he could have produced, happy wasn't one I'd been expecting, and I tried to dig a bit deeper. "I'm afraid I don't see the problem, Fausto. Isn't being happy a good thing?"
"Yes, no. The thing is that she's unusually happy."
Comprehension began to dawn on me. "And you want to know what, or possibly who, might be making her so happy? Are you sure it isn't you?"
"Sorry, Dan, she's coming. I need to ring off. See you later."
And the line went dead. I looked down at Oscar. Well, that's a first. It would appear that people can be too happy. He looked up at me and nodded towards the now empty water bowl. I felt sure that if I were to fill it with steak, he would no doubt be as happy as Fausto's wife, but somehow I had a feeling that I was going to find that it wasn't food that was putting a smile on her face. Chapter 2. Tuesday evening. Fausto Giardino arrived bang on the dot of 7, and we sat down outside my house in the shade of the pergola I'd built the previous year, now festooned with roses, clematis and vines, on which there were even some vestigial bunches of tiny grapes. The sun was close to the horizon, and the garden was bathed in a deep, ruby-red glow. As it was aperitivo time, Anna had insisted on preparing a tray with slices of cheese and salami, while I dug out a bottle of wine. She set it down on the table, shook hands with Fausto, and then retired diplomatically into the house again. Oscar, after greeting Fausto, raised his nose, sniffed appreciatively, and cast a longing look in the direction of the salami before stretching out on the ground at my feet, one eye open, just in case he might get lucky. I poured 2 glasses of cold white wine and pushed one across the cast-iron table towards my guest. "Here, Fausto, tell me what you think of this. It isn't your wine, but it's one I got when I was up on the Riviera coast a month or 2 ago." He took a mouthful and swirled it around in his mouth reflectively before swallowing it and nodding. "That's a good wine. Thank you. I like Chardonnay. Everybody seems to be planting it these days. I think maybe I need to do the same." We nibbled cheese and salami and chatted about grapes and wine briefly before he set down his glass and leant across the table towards me. "Sorry I had to cut off the call before, but Maria came out of the house." "Still looking happy?" I did my best to keep my tone light.
"Positively beaming. The thing is, Signor Armstrong, Dan, since my father passed away, I've been working all hours, and I hardly see her. During the day, I'm out in the fields, and in the evenings, I have my accountancy work to do. I would have expected her to be miserable, but instead, she looks like she's won the lottery."
He caught my eye for a moment and shook his head.
"I wish she had won a few million, but I'm afraid it isn't that."
I took a good look at him in the fading sunlight. He was probably still in his late 30s, although he'd always tended to look a bit older. His expression this evening was definitely one of considerable concern, and I hastened to add a bit of reassurance. "Since your father's death, you and Maria have moved into your dad's house, and because you're home all the time, surely she should be seeing more of you. You never know, maybe she was getting a bit lonely before, and having you around is what has cheered her up." His expression didn't change, and I could see that he wasn't buying that, so I tried again. "Maybe she's just a naturally happy person."
"She's always been quite a happy person, but there's definitely more to it than that now."
He leant even further across the table towards me and lowered his voice.
"Earlier, while she was in the bathroom, I took a quick look in her diary. I couldn't find anything there to explain things, but I did see an entry for tomorrow afternoon. It just says 3 o'clock and the letters C.O. Nothing more."
C.O. Do you know anybody with those initials? I saw him shake his head. Or might it be a place? What if the C stands for cafe? Maybe she's meeting a friend there.
"Maybe, but who and where?"
"I'm sure your wife must have lots of friends. Can you think of any whose names begin with O or C?"
"The only one I can think of is a woman called Claudia, but her surname doesn't start with an O, and besides which, she lives in Bologna. I can't think of anybody whose name begins with an O."
To me, it seemed incredibly unlikely that an unfaithful wife would actually write the initials of her paramour in a diary that might be seen by her husband. The more I thought about this, the more convinced I was becoming that there had to be an innocent explanation. I took a sip of the wine and decided to approach things head-on. "Have you spoken to her about your concerns? I can understand you don't want to let her know you've been looking in her diary, but just in general terms, have you asked her why there's always a smile on her face these days?"
"Just casually, over dinner, without making a big deal of it. And every time, she gives me the same answer."
"And that is?"
"She's happy because she loves me."
"Well, there's nothing wrong with that, is there?"
"No, of course not. But we've been married for 4 years now, and I can't understand why it's taken her so long to let her love for me show so strongly. No, I think she might be happy because I'm so busy, and as a result, she's seeing less of me, which maybe means she can see somebody else more."
He caught my eye again, and this time there was almost a pleading expression on his face.
"The thing is, Dan, I love her deeply, and I would hate to lose her. But somehow I'm afraid I am losing her."
I still had a feeling he was making a mountain out of a molehill here, but I decided to humour him. "So, what would you like me to do?" He answered straight away. Evidently, he'd been considering this already. "Follow her. Could you do that? I can't do it because she would recognize my car. If you could follow her tomorrow afternoon and just see where she goes, and maybe even who she meets, I'd be very grateful. And if it turns out to be somebody quite harmless, then you can't imagine how relieved I'll be." I nodded a couple of times, but felt I should be totally straight with him. "Yes, following her shouldn't be a problem, but have you considered what might happen if I were to discover that she isn't just meeting a girlfriend, but it's something more serious, like another man, for instance? Are you ready for that? I still think you do much better to sit down and talk it out with her." I had several more tries to get him to just go home and speak to his wife, but I soon realised I was on a hiding to nothing. He had clearly already made up his mind, and equally clearly he had a stubborn streak. Finally, rather unwillingly, I agreed to follow his wife the next day and report back. We arranged that he would call me in the afternoon as soon as she left the house, and I would follow her at a discreet distance. To avoid any complications, I went into the house and brought out what Anna refers to as my bag of tricks, a small case filled with surveillance devices from which I produced a tracker. I showed him how to attach this little black box, the size of a cigarette packet, magnetically to the inside of the wheel arch of his wife's car. From there, it would be invisible, but it would transmit a signal to my receiver, giving me her car's exact location. He asked me about my charges, but seeing as he was my neighbour, and also given that I had a feeling this was going to turn out to be a simple misunderstanding of some kind, I told him not to worry. Tomorrow afternoon would be on me. He looked most grateful, and the conversation moved on to more general matters, like, inevitably, the vendemmia. Or, in his case, not only the grape harvest this month, but also the olive harvest before Christmas. He told me he had 73 olive trees, some over 100 years old. And then he went on to tell me that good olive oil wasn't always easy to find, and wasn't always what it appeared to be. "You have to be so careful these days. There are so many scammers around." He used the Italian word imbroglione, which translates as cheats or scammers. Scammers? In what way? "Most people around here are still honest, but it's not the same all over. Here, we harvest the olives, take them down to the mill, and there they get pressed, producing the oil. We collect the oil, bring it back here, and bottle it. We then sell it direct to locals like you, or we take it to the farmer's market." He looked up at me and shook his head. "But not everybody plays by the rules." In answer to my raised eyebrows, he continued, "Corn oil costs a whole lot less than olive oil. So what some less scrupulous people are doing is diluting good olive oil with cheap corn oil and selling it as if it was the real thing. Obviously, for people like that, their profit margins go shooting up, but the reputation of Italian olive oil goes down, and that affects all of us." I was fascinated. As an ex-police officer, I'd come across my fair share of scammers over the years, and I knew that online scams were now fleecing people left, right, and centre, but I hadn't realised that crooks had moved into the olive oil business. "Are the police looking into it?" He shrugged. They say they are, but they have enough to do as it is. After all, olive oil is only one of the scams being pulled. In my accountancy business, I keep running into victims of online fraud, some losing tens of thousands. But there are even scams involving wine and salami." "Salami? How can you fake a sausage?" "It's what goes into them." He produced a hint of a smile. "Have you got the cat?" I shook my head and pointed down at my snoozing Labrador. "I don't think Oscar would approve." He caught my eye. "Let's just say that in some parts of Italy, cats are in short supply." Comprehension and a fair shot of disgust began to dawn on me. "You're saying—" He nodded and pointed at the 2 remaining slices of salami on the plate in front of us. "That's right. Meow." But he was quick to correct himself. "Not this lovely finocchiona, of course. This is genuino and excellent." Doing my best to dismiss the unpalatable image from my mind, I returned to the subject of his wife and we arranged that I would be waiting out of sight on the lane from his farm to the main road from 2:15 onwards the next day. He would call me as soon as his wife left home, and then it would be up to me to follow her to her destination and report back. After this, we shook hands and he left, keen to return to his unusually happy wife. There was still something about this that didn't sound right, and I hoped my intervention would be able to rid his mind of suspicion. I went back inside and received a smile from Anna. She also smiles a lot, and I found myself smiling more and more since I met her. She raised an eyebrow. "Solved his problems?" I said I'd help him out. Hopefully I'll get to the bottom of it. I didn't say more because I've been trying to make a point of not discussing cases with her so as to keep my business at arm's length. My commitment to my job as a DCI in London had ultimately been responsible for my divorce, and I was desperate for history not to repeat itself. She gave me another smile. "I'm sure you will, amore mio." We normally speak English together because her English is a whole lot better than my Italian. This is a result of her having been married to a Brit and having spent 20 years lecturing at a university in England until her divorce and her return to Italy. She ran the back of her hand over her forehead. "As it's so hot tonight, I'm not doing hot food. How does a mixed salad with a few slices of ham and some more of the finocchione sound?" Fausto's cat story came to mind once more, but I wisely decided not to repeat what he had said. Instead, I headed to the larder and brought out the leg of cured ham on its metal stand. Since settling here in Tuscany, I'd developed a distinct taste for the local ham, and normally had a leg on the go at any one time. I chose the sharpest knife and set about cutting a few thin slices. The first always goes to my ever-hungry Labrador, and it disappeared down his throat without touching the sides. Over dinner, Anna told me about her day working in the library, studying the rise and fall of the all-powerful Medici family. I told her about my Herculean struggles with the cyber-security seminar, and she looked sympathetic. As we reached the end of the meal, we were sitting in the gathering dusk, unwilling to get up and turn on a light, when my phone started ringing. I picked it up and saw that it was Virgilio. "Ciao, Virgilio. Is this business or pleasure?" Virgilio Pisano, formerly Inspector Pisano and now recently promoted to Commissario Pisano of the Florence Murder Squad, was my best friend here in Italy and the husband of my PA, Lena. We had met a couple of years earlier and had become firm friends. I sometimes helped him out when he had cases involving English speakers, and he very kindly often passed investigative business my way that didn't fall under the police umbrella. His rank of commissario was roughly the equivalent of my former rank of detective chief inspector, and it was no surprise that we'd formed a close friendship. "Ciao, Dan. It's business, I'm afraid. Might you be free tomorrow morning, by any chance?" As far as I could remember, I had nothing pressing on my agenda this week, and I always try to help Virgilio whenever I can. "Tomorrow morning should be fine, although I've got a commitment tomorrow afternoon for an hour or so. What's happened?"
"Do you know the Podere Dei Santi?"
"The luxury hotel on the way to Montespatoli? I know of it, although I've never had the money to go there."
"That's the place. A body was found near there earlier this afternoon. At first sight, it appears to have been a hit-and-run accident. The poor guy was run over by a truck. But when I went out there, I got the feeling that there's something not quite right. Gianni's doing the autopsy this evening, but if he finds anything untoward, I'll need to interview everybody in the area, including all the staff and guests at the hotel and winery in the morning. The thing is, a lot of the guests don't speak Italian, and I'd value your help with interpreting. But I'd also like to get your take on what's going on there."
"There's a winery there?"
"Close by. I'm not sure at this stage whether it belongs to the hotel or if it's independent, but it's pretty big, and the death took place right by it."
"What about the hotel? Who owns that?"
"An American rock star called Digger, apparently."
From his tone, it was clear what he thought of American rock stars. As for me, I really liked the stuff Digger and his band had produced back in the 70s, 80s and 90s, and I had a number of his albums. A quick calculation told me that Digger had to be well into his 70s by now. He and the band had split up about 15 years earlier, and I hadn't heard anything much from him since. Did this mean he'd now become a hotelier? Quite a career change. How come he owns a hotel here? Virgilio's tone was acid.
They're all doing it nowadays. Singers, actors, footballers, racing drivers, and the like. I believe the technical term is diversifying their portfolio. They have more money than they know what to do with, so they spread it around.
Well, of course, I'll be happy to help. By the way, when you say something wasn't quite right, what did you mean? Are you saying that some of the people you saw are a bit suspicious?
I haven't done any formal interviews, but from what I've seen, my first impression is that a few of the guests are of the shake hands and count your fingers afterwards variety. There looked like a little group of real art cases there. Not really what you'd expect to find in a hotel charging 500 or 600 euros a night. Not all of the guests look suspicious, obviously, but there's definitely a hard core of half a dozen. We've taken their names, and we're running them through the system, and it wouldn't surprise me if we find that one or two have criminal records. I'll send you a text later this evening. If Johnny says the guy's death was just an accident, well, I won't take things any further. But if we turn something up, I'd appreciate your company. So, in that case, could I pick you up around 9?
That would be fine. No, on second thoughts, I'll come in my van because I've got to get back for the afternoon and I don't want to put you out. Do you think I can bring Oscar, or is the place too posh?
Of course you have to bring Oscar. He's part of the team now. And if they object, we'll tell them he's a sniffer dog.
I glanced down at Oscar, stretched out at my feet, no doubt dreaming of squirrels, his sworn enemies, and slices of ham. When it comes to food, he's an expert sniffer. I'll wait for your text and maybe see you tomorrow. Ciao. Virgilio's text arrived at 9:15 that night. It was short and not very sweet. Definitely murder, and 2 of the guests have criminal records. See you at the hotel at 9. Thanks. Chapter 3. Wednesday morning. I got up early next morning and took Oscar for a good long walk before it got too hot. The sky was completely cloudless once more, and I felt sorry for the farmers around here. There was no sign of Fausto Giardino as we walked past his land, and I found myself hoping that my surveillance mission this afternoon would result in an innocent explanation for the smile on his wife's face. As for what awaited me this morning, I was rather looking forward to checking out the expensive luxury hotel and seeing what impression Virgilio's half a dozen hard cases had on me. Was the hotel hosting some kind of bad guys convention, maybe? And of course, there was always the possibility that Digger himself might be in residence. It would be quite an experience to meet the old rocker in person. It took only 15 minutes to get from my home to the Podere Dei Santi, the Saints' estate in the hills to the south. Entry was through a pair of impressive stone gateposts and up a gently curving drive flanked by iconic Tuscan cypress trees. As I climbed the hill towards the hotel, I could see a sprawling series of old red brick buildings down the slope to my right, with a tractor and a pickup parked outside. It looked as though this was the winery Virgilio had mentioned. The villa itself was magnificent. Set on the crest of the hill, surrounded by a beautifully maintained formal garden, it was a 3-story traditional Tuscan villa, complete with dovecot in the centre of the roof. The walls were a light ochre colour, and there were dark green louvered shutters at the windows. Beyond the gardens were geometrically perfect rows of vines, stretching out in a fan shape in all directions. The front entrance was up a short flight of stone steps, with beautiful statues of Romanesque figures on plinths on either side. In front of this was a gravelled parking area, and a quick calculation told me that the combined value of the cars parked here would probably amount to almost as much as the very expensive property itself. I counted no fewer than 3 Ferraris, 2 other supercars that I didn't recognise. Vehicles costing hundreds of thousands of pounds have never been my speciality, and a gleaming selection of Mercedes and BMWs. Clearly, this wasn't budget accommodation. There were 4 police cars parked by the entrance, and I recognised Sergeant Innocenti, today in plain clothes, standing by one of them, talking into his phone. I'd worked alongside him on a number of occasions, and apart from the fact that he was a conscientious police officer, I knew that he was also a nice guy. I parked alongside his car and climbed out. It was already warm in the sun, but still bearable, and I went around to let Oscar out of the back of my van. He jumped out happily and made a beeline for his old friend Marco Innocenti, standing up on his hind legs to greet him. I followed him over and greeted Marco, but less effusively. As his call finished, he bent down to pet Oscar before holding out his hand towards me.
Ciao, Dan. It's good to see you again.
Ciao, Marco. Tell me, does the fact that you're no longer in uniform mean something, like promotion, for instance? He grinned at me.
That's right. The boss got promotion, and so did I.
I shook his hand vigorously. Congratulations, Inspector Innocenti. So who's taken your place? Who's your right-hand man? He pointed into the car.
I now have a right-hand woman, Sergeant Diana Dini.
I glanced inside and saw a female officer deep in a telephone conversation, scribbling in a notebook on her knee. She looked businesslike, and I hoped she would prove to be as efficient as the man she was replacing.
Ciao, Dan. Thanks for coming.
I felt a hand on my shoulder and turned to find Virgilio doing his best to fend off a boisterous greeting from Oscar with his other hand.
Oscar, I'm pleased to see you too, but get off.
Dan, things are hotting up here. He led me across to a stone bench, conveniently situated out of earshot of anybody at the villa. He sat down, and I dissuaded Oscar from climbing onto his lap as I sat down beside him. I was keen to hear the latest developments. You said in your message that the dead man wasn't killed in an accident. What did Gianni say? I knew Gianni, the pathologist, pretty well by now, after a few cases with which I'd been involved. I thought you said the victim was run over by a truck.
That's right. But Gianni says the victim was already dead when that happened. He was actually killed an hour or so before the truck was involved.
And when would that have been?
Between 2 and 3, yesterday afternoon. The body was found just after 4.
Do you know who he was?
He shook his head. Nothing so far. His pockets had been emptied, and his fingerprints don't match anyone on our records. I've got my people checking for anybody reported missing, but again, nothing has come up so far. From the look of his hands, he wasn't a manual laborer, and his only distinguishing mark is a tattoo of what looks like an eagle on his shoulder.
So, how was he killed?
He was strangled, with a cord or rope tightened from behind. There are scratch marks on his neck where he must have struggled, and traces of his own skin under his fingernails.
He caught my eye for a moment.
He was quite a small guy, but even so, whoever did this must have been big and strong, like some of the guests here.
You said that 2 of the guests have been in trouble with the law. What for? I wagged my finger at Oscar and told him to stop pestering Virgilio. They have always been best buddies, but the commissario had work to do. I was impressed to see him do as he was told and wander back to sit at my feet.
One for grievous bodily harm, and the other for possession of an offensive weapon with intent.
Virgilio pulled out his notebook.
I have yet to interview them, but I get the impression they're here as minders for 3 big fish.
What sort of big fish? Why would they need protection?
I have no idea as yet, but I wouldn't mind betting that they're involved in something smelly.
How smelly? Are we talking organized crime?
He met my eye and shrugged. We've sent the names to the anti-mafia people in Rome, and we're waiting for them to report back, but it wouldn't surprise me. There's just something about these guys.
I had heard of the DIA, the Anti-Mafia Investigation Division of the Italian Security Services, but I'd never had any dealings with them. Virgilio told me that they kept a central record of suspected mafiosi and should be able to confirm if any of the men here had links to organized crime. But I couldn't think why mafia bosses should choose to come here to the wilds of Tuscany, and I put the question to Virgilio, who shook his head in response.
I have no idea. We're a long way from the mafia heartlands down south. But of course, that may have been on purpose. Maybe these guys deliberately chose an out-of-the-way hotel in rural Tuscany so as not to be discovered or disturbed. Maybe they're planning a takeover or something like that. So, for all I know, this could be the start of a gangland war. I've got a couple of officers interviewing the staff, and I plan on interviewing the Italian speakers among the guests this morning, and that includes our suspicious characters. Language won't be a problem, as long as they don't start talking to me in Sicilian or Calabrian dialect. Just to be on the safe side, I've got 4 officers in 2 cars going around all the houses in the area as well, questioning everybody they find, in case it turns out he was killed by one of the locals.
What's the story on the winery? I saw it as I drove in, and it looks like quite a big enterprise. Virgilio glanced at his notebook.
The winery and the hotel both belong to this character called Digger.
The hotel is managed by a man called Ernesto Valentini, and the manager of the winery is called Fabiano Mancini. Apparently, the wine they produce is called Rockstar Chianti. If you've got it, flaunt it, although I've never heard of it before." He seemed unimpressed. "The manager of the hotel seems straight enough, but I'll interview him properly this morning."